The movie starts with an opening scene of the Museum of Contemporary Art, Lisbon. A hooded man is within the building with a duffel bag and flashlight. He has to get out of view when he hears voices. Two other men, seemingly in security uniform with flashlights of their own, step into view. The hooded man, from his spot in hiding, gets hold of the rodent Danade worth 700,000 euros and throws it out a window. The artifact shatters and an alarm goes off. It's a strategy of sacrificing one artifact to distract the security men, so the robber can fill his duffel bag with so much more artifacts. From Lisbon, the duffel bag travels to Valencia, then Marseille, then Rome, and many more landmarks before it seemingly finds its destination in Belgrade, Serbia. A man is being tortured by two henchmen at the order of a Mr. Dulgen. The man pleads to sign everything, and Mr. Dulgen, whose main focus is on the triptych in front of him, gestures that the man be taken away. The henchmen soon return to Mr. Dulgen's side, and he drills one, who happens to be his favorite cousin, to explain what the art in front of them depicts. A call comes in and Mr. Dulgen takes it. It's short and depicts an agreement on both speakers' end. The next scene shows a bustling club. A woman, Vedrina, takes several hasty drinks before approaching Paul, who is being entertained by some dancers. Vedrina starts to dance on him. He tries to shun her, but she calls him by name and warns she's not someone he should piss. Paul gets confused as he doesn't recall knowing her. She tells him she's had his eyes on him and pushes off one of the dancers that was entertaining him. The dancer falls into the water and people think it's fun to jump after her. Paul expresses to Vedrina that an unpredictable woman has his attention and they should meet in the men's bathroom in 5 minutes. He urges her to go first and wait for him. The night continues with Paul driving through the streets, several women from the party. Meanwhile, Mr. Dulgen meets outside with someone to retrieve the fountain of Dulgen from a duffel bag. He and his henchmen begin driving off to somewhere in a tiny car with a failing engine. In Bajan's defense, they were told to pick a car that would be inconspicuous. One of the girls in Paul's car starts undressing and wilding, and Paul momentarily turns to tell her to get herself together. The split distraction is all it takes for him to run into Mr. Dulgen's car. The undressed woman flies from the force and lands on the roof of the other car. Paul gets out, makes sure the woman is okay, then hoists her back into the car. He points out the other driver was at fault for having his car in the middle of the road. A dumbfounded Mr. Dulgen opens the trunk of the car to find his artifact broken. Before Paul drives off, he tells Mr. Dulgen they should stop by at the front desk of Hotel Belgrade, so the expenses of the damage will be covered. In Moscow, Russia, Dasha wishes Peta a safe flight. They hug, and he tells her not to worry. She promises she'll try, and he heads towards a taxi. Dasha is on a train with her friend Julia. Julia likes the idea that Dasha is taking interest in other things while Petya is away. She asks Dasha if she will be going to Belgrade, but Dasha shrugs. Julia teases Dasha about her old flame, Paul, but Dasha maintains she doesn't intend to see him. She recalls that everything with Paul is complicated as he can't even pick between a brunette or a blonde. Paul is in his paradise, proving Dasha's point by having both a brunette and a blonde for his entertainment. Paul shows at the hotel, wearing proudly the air of ownership. His staff greet him as he makes his way to the front desk. The receptionist tensely gestures towards some guests waiting for him. It's Mr. Dulgen and his henchmen. Mr. Dulgen wordlessly hands over the bill for his broken fountain of Dulgen. It cost 3 million euros. Mr. Dulgen explains that what Paul broke is an expensive artwork. Paul thinks it's a joke until he's dragged across the length of the hotel like a luggage. His staff bid him farewell as he's helplessly taken away. Mr. Dulgen and his henchmen return back to his lair and torture Paul by hanging him over a deep hole in the ground. Paul pleads he doesn't have such money to cover the damage at the moment, and Mr. Dulgen hints that his grand hotel can be used as a collateral. Mr. Dulgen hears his daughter calling for him and urges the henchmen to pull up Paul and cover up the hole. Paul is on his feet and in a friendly embrace with Mr. Dulgen when his daughter enters the room. She queries if her father has been up to no good again, harassing people and so. But Mr. Dulgen feigns Paul is a business partner of his. On closer look, his daughter, Vedrina, notices the so-called business partner is Paul. It takes a few seconds, but Paul remembers her and apologizes that her stood her up at the party. He claims to have been busy and has only just freed his schedule. She admits she's happy to see him. Her father picks up on their interaction and pulls his daughter aside to speak with her. While Paul is alone with the henchman, he glances round the room and takes note he's surrounded by art. He initially thinks they're all good-looking copies, but is informed by one of the henchmen that these are the real deal. Mr. Dulgin comes back with a different tone. He walks Paul through his home, stating him and Paul got off on the wrong foot. Mr. Dulgin lets on he's promised his darling Vedrina she will get what she wants. Paul affirms Vedrina is a number in the whole of Serbia, but he's a lone wolf not ready for commitment. Mr. Dulgin voices there's no room for a different decision. Paul will marry Vedrina. Paul offers him his hotel instead, and Mr. Dulgin chimes he'll take that too, but the marriage will hold. 2 weeks later, the wedding rehearsal is taking place in the hotel. But in the middle of the vows, Vedrina decides nothing is to her taste, and she cannot say I do. She starts to dash orders about how differently things should be done. Mr. Dulgin steps in and expresses he's no fan of the decision, but he just wants his princess to be happy, and so Paul is expected to at least give the whole ordeal a try. Meanwhile, Vedrina is busy throwing a tantrum of how no one is doing anything right on her wedding day. Paul asks Mr. Dulgin if he can meet someone at the airport, and Mr. Dulgin reluctantly allows it on the condition that Paul returns soon. Dasha arrives at the airport at the same time Paul is there to pick up a friend. Paul and the friend leave without Dasha and Paul, realizing they're in the same vicinity. After Paul leaves, Dasha looks hopelessly around for the chauffeur that's supposed to pick her up. A man notices and approaches her, feigning to be the chauffeur she's been waiting for. He's able to convince her to come with him. Dasha and Paul get another opportunity to meet themselves at the traffic lights, but fate has them ultimately missing themselves again. Meanwhile, Vedrina barks ruthless orders to get her ceremony up to par. Paul and his friend, Ivan, arrive at the hotel, and Paul warns that Ivan is about to witness a sticky situation. They walk in on Vedrina, harassing one of the workers, and Paul excuses both himself and Ivan's sin so Vedrina can get back to her wedding preparations. The two friends find an outdoor setting to discuss the situation. Ivan opines there's no other way and Paul will just have to find happiness with Vedrina. Paul comments that he lost happiness a long time ago. Dasha starts to suspect the man she's with is not her real guide. She gets the confirmation she needs when the real guide calls her phone. She steps out of the man's car and threatens to call the police. This makes the man drive off with Dasha's luggage still in his van. She starts chasing after the van and runs into Paul in the process. As they lay on the ground, face inches apart, Paul remarks he's quite glad yet tense seeing her. Dasha gets up first so Paul can pull himself up. He tries to embrace her, but she backs away, stating she needs to contact the police so they can retrieve her belongings. Without a passport, no hotel will receive her. Paul offers to receive her in his place, reassuring her her things will be retrieved eventually. As they walk to the front desk, Paul asks why Dasha didn't think to notify him she would be in Belgrade. He wonders if it's because they broke up 4 years prior and have not been in touch since then. He says he can be her proper guide around the city, but she's reluctant to take the offer. Just then, Vedrina walks up to them and demands to know who Dasha is. Paul calmly explains she's an acquaintance from Russia that he just ran into. Vedrina takes one good look at Dasha and decides to exert possession over Paul. She kisses Paul and tells him she doesn't want him late for their rehearsal. When she leaves, Paul lies, saying Vedrina is his sister. He goes as far as saying how Vedrina's display of affection is a normal Serbian culture, which involves kissing and smacking two guests in the same manner. He hurries Dasha along, reminding her they have an excursion, and she should get some rest in the meantime. Paul then pleads with Ivan to fill in for him while he steps out with Dasha. Paul and Dasha get into his car, but they're oblivious to the henchmen watching. Eager to do right by their boss, they decide to tail Paul and Dasha to gather evidence that she's actually his mistress. Dasha begins sightseeing. They go to the Gardalj Tower that offers a beautiful aerial view of the old town of Zemun. Dasha makes Paul take pictures of her with her camera and cites that he hears she got married. She answers dismissively and throws a similar question his way. He answers that he's yet to leave the bachelor's realm. He spots the henchman below and begins to hurry an oblivious Dasha across the city while they chase after him. Paul loses them and resumes their excursion on a more proper note in the artistic neighborhood. He narrates how artists in the neighborhood are known to gather there and paint murals. Dasha spots a painting on a building that very much looks like her. Paul denies it, stating he's not familiar with the neighborhood. Yet, a local greets him by name as they pass by. She's moved to stare longer at the mural, then take a picture of it. Back in her suite, Paul has arranged an outfit for her with a note. The note reads he still remembers her measurements, and he seeks to meet her at 8 in the evening. The henchmen report to Mr. Dulgin about Paul out with another woman. After Mr. Dulgin gets over the mesmerizing fact of people being sent into Mars to explore life's possibilities, he asks who this woman is. Ivan is still filling in for the rehearsals. He and Vedrina are rehearsing the dance routine. Paul comes back in just then and excuses that the day has been chaotic. Vedrina goes off to pee when her father comes to rattle Paul about the woman the henchman saw him with. Paul seamlessly lies, saying she's an investor, and it's only routine to involve himself in business ventures to grow his business so he can provide for his fiancée. His response touches Mr. Dulgen, who apologizes for being so intense. He mentions they should step out for a drink, but Paul declines, feigning tiredness. When Paul steps out of his suite, all dressed up to meet with Dasha as planned, he finds the henchman stationed at his door. They were told by Dulgen to keep watch like he slept. Paul has to call his receptionist to arrange a boss evacuation, which involves numerous of his staff standing outside his window with an air mattress to catch him when he jumps. Paul meets up with Dasha, and he treats her to an outdoor restaurant experience with a serenade. The song he picks to sing is an old Serbian song that has most people singing along. Dasha records the whole thing and asks to see more of the city. While they walk, the serenade crew catches up to them and insists they play up to their fee as they don't accept tips. Paul and Dasha continue their walk with the serenade team trailing and playing behind. They return back to the hotel and Dasha thanks Paul for an exciting day. He offers to give her more excitement the following day. She retires to her suite and forgets her camera with Paul. He goes through the pictures and finds one of Dasha and her husband. This changes his demeanor for the rest of the night. The next day, Mr. Dulgen wants the henchman to keep a better eye on Paul and Dasha. The henchmen dutifully approach the pair, one dragging Paul away while the other tries to keep Dasha in place. Dasha shows she's a woman that can defend herself and frees Paul, hitting Mr. Dulgen in the process. They escape in the Serenade's team bus, and Paul gets a call from Mr. Dulgen threatening both him and Dasha. Paul ends the call and suggests they leave for the airport. Dasha asks if her passport has been found and Paul answers that the police are most likely still on it. At the mention of the police, she expresses they should report the incident with Mr. Dulgen and his henchmen, but Paul waves her off. Paul hires Jealousy's boat services, and the Serenade team will still need to tag along because they're yet to exhaust the fee they were paid. The boat takes them to Paul's village, where he is announced and welcomed by the community. An aunt tells him his grandfather isn't feeling too well, and Paul excuses himself from Dasha to go see him. With Paul gone, the community take advantage of the language barrier and scrutinize Dasha. Someone calls her too skinny and wonders how she'll bear Paul any children. Paul's aunt gives her a long skirt to put over her shorts to offer more modesty, and a few people around the table chime at her to eat. Dasha notices two women wearing her clothes and asks them where they got it from. Just then, the fake guide shows up and Dasha starts to chase after him. She catches up with him and demands her passport, but a whole new chase begins when the guy's wife reads the wrong message and chases them both with an axe. Paul sees his grandfather, who waves off the heart attack that has him on bed rest. He's more excited to see Paul and the new bride he's brought to the village. He uses a bell to call the community's attention, letting them know that dear Paul has returned with a bride. Just then, Dasha and the fake guide make it back to everyone else. Dasha pleads with Paul to clarify she's not a home wrecker. He fuels the idea that Dasha is actually his bride, and this calms the crazy woman with the axe. Grandpa rings his bell again and voices that against all doubts that Paul would not invite them to his wedding in Belgrade. He's in fact done more. He's brought the wedding to the village. Dasha remains oblivious because of the language barrier and Paul's easy lies. The community cheers and someone swifts her up her feet because a new bride calls for celebration. Dasha starts to catch on with what's actually happening and confronts Paul about it, while Grandpa is busy giving his speech. Paul promises to come clean after his grandfather's speech, but then they notice he's on the verge of another heart attack. Out of sympathy, Dasha decides she'll play along for a while longer. She joins in the celebration, playing the happy bride-to-be for Paul's sake. In the midst of dancing, Sreko hands Dasha back her passport. He lets on to her that the village owes Paul a lot. He gives out a good percentage of the money he earns from his hotel to the village development. The whole community loves him. Grandpa rings his bell yet again to get everyone's attention. It's time for the bride and groom to display their love and affection for each other. The crowd chants and Paul helplessly fidgets. Dasha gives in to the crowd's chants and pulls Paul in for a passionate kiss. It leaves him dazed and questioning what's gotten into her. She's supposed to leave the next day and is very much married, but she replies she won't be returning back to Petter. It turns out Petter was among the Elon Musk's Life at Mars project and has actually gone to Mars to start a new life. Paul thinks Dasha is telling a cruel joke when she reveals this to him. He asks why she's still wearing her wedding ring if there's no hope, and she decides then and there to take it off and throw it away. The party from their avalanche encounters is very much still in full swing, and Dasha leads Paul out of the chicken's pen to dance with. Meanwhile, Ivan gets tortured in Mr. Dulgen's lair. The henchmen swing him over the deep hole, trying to get Paul's whereabouts. A petrified Ivan swears he has no idea where Paul has gone off to, and Mr. Dulgen decides to end his torture. He tells Ivan he'll be Vedrina's company until Paul returns. Paul and Dasha are seen off by the community to their honeymoon room for the night. Behind closed doors, Paul states he'll respect Dasha's privacy since they're not actually a couple. He stakes out the window, watching the community retreat for the night. Dasha edges wordlessly and closer to him so their lips can meet. The night ends with passion like the community expected. Paul gets up in the middle of the night while Dasha is still sound asleep. He grabs his jacket and doesn't realize when his phone falls out. Srečko is sleeping in his van when Paul approaches and asks him to drive him back to Belgrade. Some of the villagers see Paul leave. Mr. Dulgen has the robber deliver another urinal-looking art to him. The robber advises him to be careful with this one, as the artifacts are now heavily guarded. Paul arrives back in Belgrade and goes to see Mr. Dulgen. He voices he can't marry Vedrina and would rather his hotel is confiscated instead. He starts to give Mr. Dulgen ideas of how he can make the hotel flourish more once it's in his custody. Mr. Dulgen places his new urinal art on a mantle and Paul takes to pick it up and admire it. He thinks it's the same one he broke earlier and commends Mr. Dulgen for having it fixed up nicely. Mr. Dulgen growls at him to return his piece back to his mantle and Paul does, but he ends up brushing past it, causing it to fall to the ground. An angry Mr. Dulgen has his men hang Paul over the hole. He imposes he will not only take Paul's hotel, but Paul will marry his daughter. Paul hopelessly concedes. Mr. Dulgen mandates that Paul's village friends and grandpa will be invited for the wedding, and should Paul try anything funny, they'll all pay the consequences. Ivan and Vedrina get themselves acquainted. Ivan tells her about his business debt in Moscow, and she laments about not having as much freedom as she wants. Her father steps in to announce that Paul has arrived and Vedrina can talk to him the following day. As for Ivan, he's free to leave, but Vedrina offers to fix him a room should he choose to stay. Paul becomes like a prisoner, telling Srečko through the closed rock gate that he doesn't have to tell Dasha anything because he'll call her himself. Srečko and the serenade team leave when Paul realizes he's left his phone. He pleads with the henchmen to let him retrieve it, but there are orders to follow. Dasha finds Paul's phone and picks Ivan's call. He informs her about Paul and Vedrina's wedding, realizing a little too late that she won't respond well to the news. Dasha then packs her things and heads back to Belgrade. She finds Srečko, who insists on being her ride to the airport. Paul's grandpa is also in the van, and he wants to give a personal farewell. Srečko tells Dasha everything that has led to Paul's pending wedding to his horrible bride. Dasha has no sympathy, stating it's Paul's fault for constantly being untruthful. Srečko defends that Paul was only trying to protect her because he loves her, but Dasha can't understand what kind of love that is. They reach the cemetery and help Grandpa to the gravestone of his late wife. Grandpa narrates how his marriage wasn't always a smooth ride. One time he quarreled with his wife, and she threw her wedding ring into the river. He did the same, and after a while he carved out new rings and proposed they got remarried. It became a tradition. They got remarried after every quarrel, and now he's lost count of how many times in total. He places their rings on her tombstone and advises Dasha to learn from his love story. She can make peace with Paul while she still can. Dasha decides to heed to his words and asks Srečko to take her back to the hotel. She interrupts the wrong wedding because Srečko fails to tell her Paul and Vedrina's wedding is at a different venue. At the ceremony, Mr. Dulgen gifts the couple a painting worth $40 million, noting it's a painting the couple and his grandchildren will enjoy with him because they'll all be living under the same roof. Someone from Paul's family keeps remarking quite loudly that Vedrina isn't easy on the eyes, and this upsets Vedrina so much that she storms off. Mr. Dulgen puts Paul in charge of controlling his family, while Ivan is in charge of calming Vedrina down. Grandpa takes the stage, singing and causing a distraction so Paul and Dasha can escape. Paul hesitates, knowing the village community is at risk should Mr. Dulgen unleash his anger. The whole ceremony goes downhill from there and turns chaotic with everyone fighting themselves. Paul gets hold of the $40 million worth painting and threatens to vandalize it if Mr. Dulgen doesn't let him and his loved ones go. Mr. Dulgen agrees to trade peace for the painting and Paul hands over the painting. Mr. Dulgen then takes 2 guns from his henchmen and threatens Paul and his family afresh. Vedrina has a gun of her own, and she lets shots fly into the air to get everyone's attention. She tells her father that in Paul's absence, She's fallen in love with Ivan. Mr. Dulgin embraces his new son-in-law and orders his henchmen to put things back in place for the celebration. Ivan admits to Paul that marrying into Mr. Dulgin's home would help solve some of his financial issues back in Moscow. Vedrina tells her friend that marrying a man from Russia would give her more space from her doting father. Paul and Dasha return to the countryside and get married with the wedding rings his grandfather carved for him and grandmother years back. During the ceremony, Dasha sees Paul's grandmother is not dead as she was led to believe. Both grandfather and son tend to lie out of love.